The city of Crestwood, much like a well-worn coin, bore two distinct faces. One side gleamed with the polished chrome of its gleaming downtown, home to bustling courthouses, sleek corporate towers, and tree-lined avenues where prosperity seemed to bloom effortlessly. The other side, less seen and often ignored by those in power, was a labyrinth of aging brick buildings, struggling small businesses, and communities that knew the bitter taste of systemic neglect. In this latter half, life was often a tightrope walk, and the shadow of the law, rather than a shield, frequently felt like a heavy, oppressive hand. It was in this stark dichotomy that the lives of two individuals, seemingly universes apart, were about to collide with explosive force. In the heart of the city's legal bastion sat Judge Evelyn Reed. Her chambers, meticulously organized, reflected the sharp precision of her mind. Books on constitutional law and judicial precedent lined the walls, interspersed with framed accolades and photographs of a life dedicated to justice. Evelyn was a woman forged in the crucible of adversity, a daughter of Crestwood's forgotten side who had clawed her way through law school with grit and unwavering determination. At 48, she possessed a quiet gravitas that commanded respect, her presence in the courtroom an undeniable force. Her decisions were known for their meticulous adherence to the law, tempered by a deep, almost empathetic understanding of human frailties and societal pressures. She was fair, firm, and notoriously unyielding when it came to matters of injustice. Off the bench, Evelyn maintained a life of profound discipline and quiet dignity. Her early mornings began before dawn, with solitary runs through the city's quieter parks, the rhythmic thud of her feet a counterpoint to her focused thoughts. Her natural hair, a cascade of intricate braids that sometimes reached her waist, was her personal crown, a symbol of her heritage, her strength, and her refusal to conform. It was always meticulously styled, a testament to her meticulous nature. She was a pillar of her community, serving on various mentorship boards, particularly those aimed at guiding young black girls towards academic and professional success. Her personal life was deliberately private, a necessary sanctuary against the relentless scrutiny of her high-profile position. Evelyn had fought too many battles, both personal and professional, to let superficialities define her. Unbeknownst to the majority, however, Judge Reed carried a profound and deeply personal commitment to the fight against police misconduct. Years ago, her younger brother, a promising college student, had been wrongfully accused and brutally beaten by officers during a protest, his life irrevocably altered. Though the officers were eventually disciplined, the incident had left an indelible mark on Evelyn, fueling her dedication to upholding due process and holding law enforcement accountable, without compromising her judicial impartiality. She understood, intimately, the fine line between order and oppression, and she often presided over cases involving police conduct with an almost unnerving perceptiveness. Meanwhile, on the grittier streets of Crestwood's forgotten face, patrolled Officer David Miller. At 35, Miller embodied the darker underbelly of power. He was a man consumed by unchecked authority and a deep-seated racial prejudice that simmered just beneath the surface, often boiling over in his interactions with the city's black residents. His swagger was unmistakable, his smirk a familiar sight to those who crossed his path. Miller believed the law was a tool, to be wielded with brute force against those he deemed undesirable, particularly black individuals in the poorer districts. His record, though outwardly clean, was a testament to how effectively he could manipulate procedures, intimidate witnesses, and evade accountability. Whispers of excessive force and fabricated charges followed him like a shadow, but nothing ever stuck. He saw himself as a tough cop, a necessary enforcer, and relished the fear he inspired. Miller worked closely with his patrol partner, Officer Ben Carter. Carter, younger and less hardened, was still impressionable. He admired Miller's confidence and perceived effectiveness, longing for that same unwavering certainty. He largely went along with Miller's tactics, turning a blind eye to the questionable methods, believing in the broad strokes of cleaning up the streets, even if the finer details sometimes pricked at his conscience. He hadn't yet fully committed to Miller's cynical worldview, but he was dangerously close, caught in the older officer's gravitational pull. The city buzzed with the news of an upcoming high-profile case. A young, unarmed black man had been shot during a routine traffic stop by a white officer, sparking outrage and reigniting the city's long-simmering racial tensions. The case, highly publicized and fraught with political implications, had been assigned to Judge Evelyn Reed. Miller, through a twisted network of connections and a desire to be at the heart of any action, had managed to secure a spot for himself and Carter on the security detail for the courthouse during the upcoming, highly anticipated preliminary hearings. He saw it as an opportunity to reinforce his image as a law and order champion, to demonstrate his control. He felt untouchable. On a warm Tuesday morning, as the city prepared for the volatile proceedings, Evelyn Reed chose to drive herself to work. Her usual chauffeur, typically an early riser, was unexpectedly ill. Evelyn, preferring to maintain her privacy, opted not to call for a replacement. She drove her modest, unassuming sedan, blending into the morning traffic. Her braids, usually coiled neatly, were partially unbound, flowing down her back, due to a minor issue with a new styling product that morning. She wore her typical plain, conservative clothes to avoid drawing attention, before changing into her robes at the courthouse. As she drove through a less affluent section of Crestwood, a minor traffic infraction occurred. Evelyn, focused on the upcoming hearing, mistakenly drifted slightly over a solid white line while making a turn. It was a common, negligible error, easily overlooked, especially given the lack of other traffic. But in the rearview mirror, she saw the flashing lights. Officer David Miller and Officer Ben Carter, their patrol car looming, pulled her over. Miller approached her car with his usual swagger, his hand resting casually on his holstered weapon. His eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation. He saw a black woman, alone in a modest car, and his ingrained biases immediately clicked into place. This wasn't a judge. This was just another one of them in his territory, another potential troublemaker. He didn't recognize her, her appearance markedly different from her formal courtroom attire. This stop, for him, was a simple display of power, an opportunity to assert dominance. He didn't know he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. The fuse had been lit. The afternoon sun, typically a welcome warmth in Crestwood, now beat down with an oppressive intensity, reflecting off the polished hood of Officer Miller's patrol car. The air crackled with a tension that was far more palpable than the heat. Judge Evelyn Reed, a woman accustomed to controlling the narrative within her courtroom, now found herself utterly stripped of agency, trapped in a scenario where prejudice held the gavel. Officer Miller approached Evelyn's modest sedan with a deliberate, almost theatrical slowness. His eyes, cold and assessing, swept over her. He didn't see a respected legal figure. He saw only a black woman, her long, flowing braids momentarily disheveled from her earlier styling issue, and in her unassuming car, he simply noted what he perceived as a minor infraction, the kind he often used as a pretext for deeper intimidation. His hand rested casually on his holstered weapon, a silent, menacing gesture that Evelyn recognized from countless police reports she had reviewed. This was not a routine stop. This was a power play. "License and registration, ma'am." Miller's voice was clipped, devoid of courtesy, betraying his barely contained contempt. He stood too close, invading her personal space, his posture radiating aggressive authority. Evelyn, though inwardly seething at the immediate disrespect, maintained her composure. Years of professional discipline, forged in the crucible of a demanding career and countless challenging interactions, kicked in. She calmly produced her driver's license and vehicle registration. Her movements were slow, deliberate, a practiced response to de-escalate potential confrontation. Miller took the documents, his eyes barely glancing at the name before shifting to the long, dark cascade of her braids. A cruel smirk twitched at his lips. He saw them not as a symbol of cultural pride or personal expression, but as an opportunity for humiliation, a way to exert his dominance. "You know, ma'am," he drawled, letting the words hang in the air, "this city has ordinances about vehicle safety and personal hygiene. Some of these hairstyles, they can obscure vision, cause accidents." His words were thinly veiled racist tropes, designed to belittle and provoke. "Besides," he continued, leaning down closer to the window, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper, "we've been having some issues with contraband being hidden in hair around here. For public safety, we sometimes have to address these things on the spot. Evelyn's breath hitched. Her eyes, usually cool and analytical, flared with a cold fury. She understood the implication, the degrading accusation. This wasn't about traffic safety. It was about control, about dehumanization, about an officer weaponizing his power in the most intimate and personal way. This was a direct, contemptuous assault on her dignity as a black woman. "Officer, there is nothing in my hair," she stated, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "I am on my way to work. I assure you there is no need for this." She briefly considered revealing her identity, but a deeply ingrained sense of discretion, combined with a sudden, chilling realization of Miller's intent, stopped her. She knew revealing she was a judge to a man clearly operating on racial prejudice would likely only escalate his aggression, turning his casual abuse of power into a deliberate act of malice. Miller ignored her, waving over Officer Carter. "Ben, grab the shears from the trunk. We've got a public safety issue here." Carter, his brow furrowed with a flicker of confusion and discomfort, hesitated. "Shears, Dave? For what?" He looked at Evelyn, sensing the deep injustice brewing, but his deference to Miller, his desire for acceptance, held him captive. "Just do it, Carter," Miller snapped, his voice rising, a thinly veiled threat in his tone. "Or you want to explain to the captain why you're letting obvious safety hazards slide." With a heavy heart and trembling hands, Carter retrieved a pair of large, industrial-looking shears from the patrol car's trunk, the kind used for cutting seatbelts in emergencies. The metallic glint in the sunlight felt sickeningly ominous. This was the point of no return. This wasn't just a traffic stop. It was an act of public humiliation, a deliberate assault designed to strip Evelyn of her dignity. The location was a busy intersection, with early morning commuters now slowing down, their eyes drawn to the unfolding spectacle. This was Miller's performance, his demonstration of authority, and Evelyn was the unwilling centerpiece. "All right, ma'am, step out of the vehicle," Miller commanded, his voice now a triumphant sneer. "And let's make this quick, unless you want us to do it right here." Evelyn, trapped, her heart pounding with a mixture of rage and a cold primal fear, slowly emerged from her car. The sheer audacity, the sickening cruelty of his demand, left her momentarily speechless. She stood there, regal despite her distress, her shoulders back, her eyes blazing defiance even as the humiliation washed over her. Miller grabbed a handful of her long, thick braids with a rough, impersonal grip. Evelyn flinched, but refused to cry out. Carter, his face pale, closed his eyes for a split second before opening the shears. The metallic snip was shockingly loud in the morning air, a visceral sound of violation. One braid, then another, fell to the dirty pavement, each snip a calculated blow to Evelyn's spirit, to her identity. Miller ripped at the remaining braids, tearing at the roots of her hair, not just cutting, but mutilating. The scene, playing out in broad daylight, was a chilling tableau. Miller, the picture of unchecked authority, wielded the shears like a weapon. Carter, a silent accomplice, stood by, his face a mask of conflict. And Evelyn, her head now disfigured, her hair falling around her feet like discarded dignity, stared ahead, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. But in her eyes, amidst the pain, a cold, hard resolve began to crystallize. The initial searing humiliation quickly morphed into something far more dangerous. A quiet, unyielding promise of retribution. She would not forget this. She would not forgive this. Miller, satisfied with his cruel display, stepped back, surveying his handiwork with a smirk. "There. Much better. Safer for everyone. Now get out of here, and next time, think about what you're driving around with." He tossed her license and registration back into her car, letting them flutter onto the passenger seat. He didn't know the woman whose identity he had just violated. He didn't know that the high-profile case he was providing security for was about to be presided over by the very woman whose hair he had just brutally shorn. The stage was set, the antagonist had launched his fatal attack, and the hero, humiliated but unbroken, was about to step into her rightful arena. The fluorescent hum of the Crestwood Municipal Courthouse felt particularly oppressive to Officer David Miller that Tuesday afternoon. He strolled through the bustling hallways, a satisfied smirk still lingering on his face from his morning's work. He'd seen a few hushed whispers and darting glances as he passed, but they only fueled his ego. Let them stare. He was Miller, and he got results. His partner, Officer Ben Carter, walked a few paces behind him, shoulders hunched, his silence a stark contrast to Miller's swagger. Carter's conscience, a persistent, dull ache, had solidified into a sharp, undeniable pain. The image of Evelyn Reed's face, dignified even as her braids fell to the pavement, was seared into his mind. He knew, with sickening certainty, that what Miller had done was wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. Miller spotted the courthouse's chief bailiff, a burly man named Johnson, near the entrance to courtroom 3. "Morning, Johnson. All set for the big show?" Miller boomed, slapping the bailiff on the back. "Got Miller and Carter here for security detail. Best in the business." Johnson nodded, looking uncomfortable. "Yes, Officer Miller. Judge Reed's already in chambers. She's due to take the bench any minute. Packed house in there." Miller's grin widened. "Judge Reed, huh? Heard she's a tough one." "Good. This case needs a firm hand. We got a good officer on trial. Don't need any bleeding heart judges messing it up." He then turned to Carter, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Remember, Ben, we stick to the narrative. Officer Thompson acted in self-defense. That's it. Nothing else." Carter merely nodded, his gaze distant. He had slipped away during their lunch break, a churning storm in his gut, and made a single, desperate call to an internal affairs contact he barely knew. He hadn't revealed everything, but he'd hinted at grave concerns regarding Miller and recent incidents. The contact, surprised by Carter's uncharacteristic urgency, had promised to look into it, but it was a long shot, a whisper against a roar. The courtroom was a cauldron of anticipation. Every seat was filled, stern-faced reporters, civil rights activists, concerned community members, and a strong presence of uniformed police officers, creating a palpable divide. The air thrummed with unspoken tensions. Miller and Carter took up their positions near the courtroom doors, their presence meant to be a deterrent, a symbol of authority. Then a hush fell over the room. The court clerk stood. "All rise." Miller straightened, his smirk returning. He loved this part, the ceremonial weight of it all. He watched the door leading from the judge's chambers, expecting to see the usually imposing figure of Justice Eleanor Vance, the judge typically assigned to high-profile cases. But a different figure emerged. Stepping through the doorway, clad in a flowing black judicial robe that seemed to imbue her with an almost ethereal majesty, was Judge Evelyn Reed. Her presence, even from the back of the courtroom, was commanding. Miller's eyes, however, snapped to her head and his breath hitched. The intricate braids, the familiar cascade of dark hair he had so viciously shorn just hours earlier, were gone. In their place, her scalp was severely, unevenly shaved, stark patches of skin visible where the razor had torn through, leaving an almost grotesque topography. It was a brutal, visible testament to a recent, violent act. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, a wave of shock and outrage. The whispers grew louder, transforming into murmurs of horror and disbelief as people recognized the respected judge, now visibly disfigured. Reporters' pens flew across their notebooks. Phones, usually strictly forbidden, were discreetly raised by community members, attempting to capture the undeniable proof of injustice. Miller's blood ran cold. The color drained from his face, leaving it a sickly gray. His smug smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The climax was at hand. But it was not the triumph he had envisioned. 3 minutes after he had completed his cruel act, he realized the horrifying, undeniable truth. The black woman whose head he had just shaved, whose dignity he had publicly desecrated, was not just some woman. She was the presiding judge for the very trial he was now supposed to be securing. The realization hit him like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of his chest. His empire, built on intimidation and unchecked abuse, began to crumble in that very instant. Officer Carter, standing beside him, saw the horror on Miller's face. He followed Miller's gaze, his eyes widening as he, too, took in Judge Reed's disfigured appearance. He felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. The conversation he had had with his internal affairs contact, the one he thought was a long shot, suddenly felt like an urgent, desperate plea. He knew, with absolute certainty, that this would be the spark. Judge Reed, her face a mask of profound composure despite the visible violence done to her, walked with measured steps to the bench. She didn't meet Miller's eyes directly, but her gaze swept over the entire courtroom, lingering for a fraction of a second on the police officers providing security. The message in her eyes was clear, cold, and unwavering. She had seen them. She had witnessed everything. She sat down, her hand reaching automatically for the gavel. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low, steady, and resonated with an icy power that silenced the courtroom more effectively than any shouted command. "Be seated," she intoned, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. Then, her eyes, sharp as obsidian shards, fixed directly on Officer David Miller. "Officer Miller," she stated, her voice devoid of emotion, each word a hammer blow. "I believe you and Officer Carter were assigned to courthouse security for these proceedings?" Miller, frozen in fear, could only nod, a barely perceptible jerk of his head. "Good," Judge Reed continued, her voice chillingly calm. "Because I believe you both have just become key witnesses in an entirely new matter." She paused, her gaze unwavering, and then, with a slow, deliberate movement that held the weight of mountains, she lifted the gavel. It was not a gesture of dismissal or anger, but a pronouncement of cold, absolute justice. The air crackled. The city held its breath. The reverberations of Judge Evelyn Reed's chilling pronouncement echoed through courtroom 3B, silencing every whisper, every rustle, every intake of breath. Officer David Miller, still standing frozen, his face a ghastly mask of white terror, looked less like a proud law enforcer and more like a cornered animal caught in a blinding spotlight. The immediate, sickening realization that the black woman whose head he had just shaved, whose dignity he had so brutally assaulted, was the very judge now presiding over the most high-profile case of his career, hit him with the force of a physical blow. His vision tunneled, the shouts and murmurs of the courtroom fading into a distant roar, replaced by the frantic pounding of his own heart. The carefully constructed edifice of his power, built on years of intimidation, racial prejudice, and procedural manipulation, didn't just crack. It began to shatter, piece by agonizing piece, under the unyielding gaze of the woman he had so contemptuously humiliated. Beside him, Officer Ben Carter stood equally stunned, but for different reasons. The initial shock of seeing Judge Reed's disfigured scalp quickly gave way to a wave of profound guilt and dawning clarity. He had been complicit, a silent bystander to Miller's cruelty, and the image of those severed braids on the pavement now burned into his conscience with an unbearable intensity. The desperate, anonymous call he had made to Internal Affairs just hours before, a hesitant whisper of concern, suddenly felt like an insufficient, cowardly plea. He should have done more, should have intervened, should have stopped Miller. A cold, hard resolve began to solidify within him, replacing his usual deference to Miller with a fierce, almost vengeful determination to right the profound wrong he had witnessed and allowed. Judge Reed, however, showed no emotion. Her face, despite the visible trauma to her scalp, remained impassive, almost carved from stone. She let the silence stretch, allowing the gravity of the moment to permeate every corner of the courtroom. Her eyes, sharper than any razor, swept from Miller, whose pallor deepened under her gaze, to Carter, whose conflicting emotions were plainly visible, and then to the stunned faces of the uniformed officers providing security, some of whom looked away, uncomfortable witnesses to Miller's public undoing. "Bailiff," Judge Reed's voice cut through the silence, clear and precise. "Remove Officer Miller from this courtroom. He is no longer on security detail for these proceedings. He is, effective immediately, considered a material witness in a separate, ongoing investigation. He will be taken to holding and his weapon and badge will be confiscated. Officer Carter, you will remain here, under my direct order, as a witness to this order and to provide testimony as required by this court." The words, delivered with a chilling calm, were a judicial guillotine. Miller finally found his voice, a guttural roar of denial and rage. "You can't do this. This is a setup. She's crazy. She's—" Before he could finish, two burly bailiffs, their faces grim, moved swiftly to restrain him. Miller struggled, bucking against their hold, his face contorted with incandescent fury. "You'll regret this. I'll have your badge, Judge. I'll have all of you," he shrieked, his voice raw and desperate, a far cry from his earlier swagger. His outburst, rather than intimidating, only served to underscore his unraveling, a public spectacle of a man losing control. He was dragged, kicking and screaming, from courtroom 3B, his indignant roars echoing down the hallway until they faded into the muffled sounds of the courthouse. The silence that descended after Miller's forced exit was even heavier than before, punctuated only by the furious scribbling of reporters and the awed murmurs of the gallery. Prosecutor Jenkins, who had been standing, mouth agape, throughout the entire exchange, finally managed to stammer, "Your Honor, what is the meaning of this? What investigation?" Judge Reed turned her steely gaze to Jenkins. "Mr. Jenkins, as you can plainly see, a grave act of public humiliation and assault has been perpetrated against a presiding judicial officer just hours before these proceedings. While I will not, at this moment, elaborate on the precise details, it is clear that Officer Miller is deeply implicated. This court cannot, in good conscience, proceed with him present in any official capacity, nor can we allow his testimony to be presented without immediate, thorough scrutiny. This incident raises profound questions about his credibility and, by extension, the integrity of any evidence he has handled, including that in the case currently before this court." Her voice was unwavering, her authority absolute. "The proceedings for Officer Thompson's case are hereby recessed until further notice. I am ordering an immediate, full-scale internal affairs investigation into Officer David Miller's conduct, past and present. Officer Carter, you are to report to Internal Affairs immediately after this brief session to give your full testimony. Mr. Jenkins, I expect your full cooperation in this matter. This court will tolerate no obstruction of justice from any quarter." This was the unveiling in duress, not of Judge Reed's identity, which was already known, but of the depth of Miller's corruption and the systemic rot it exposed. Her appearance, a visible wound, forced the hand of justice. The raw, undeniable truth of the assault, etched onto her scalp, served as irrefutable evidence, a silent, powerful witness. The selective witnessing was playing out precisely as she needed it to. The public, the media, and even many in law enforcement could no longer ignore the tangible manifestation of Miller's malice. They couldn't dismiss this as a he said, she said scenario, or an accusation from a disempowered individual. This was a direct, contemptuous assault on the very symbol of justice, performed by a man who was supposed to uphold it. As for Carter, the choice was stark, terrifying, and ultimately undeniable. He watched Miller being dragged away, the man who had been his mentor, his guide, his corrupted compass. He saw the cold fury in Miller's eyes, the promise of vengeance, but he also saw Judge Reed, her gaze unwavering, embodying a fierce, righteous integrity that he had never truly understood until now. The fear of Miller, potent as it was finally outweighed by a profound, agonizing shame and a desperate need for moral redemption. He knew, with absolute clarity, that this was his one chance to choose a different path, to carve out his own identity as an honorable officer, even if it meant sacrificing everything. He approached the bench, his steps heavy but resolute. "Your Honor," Carter's voice was shaky, but loud enough for the reporters to hear. I can corroborate. I witnessed what Officer Miller did this morning. To the judge. And there are other instances. Patterns. Things I've seen him do. Evidence he's planted. Arrests he's fabricated to meet quotas. It goes back years. I have some notes, some indirect evidence. I'll tell Internal Affairs everything." A new wave of gasps, louder and more fervent, swept through the courtroom. This was the true shocker, the crack in the blue wall, the insider turning against the system. Reporters scrambled, shouting questions. Prosecutor Jenkins, his face now truly ashen, slumped into his chair, his entire career potentially crumbling before his eyes. He realized the depth of the hole Miller had dug, and how close he, Jenkins, had come to being completely buried in it. Justice Vance, though outwardly stoic, felt a profound sense of grim satisfaction. This was what she had fought for her entire career: accountability, transparency, truth. "Officer Carter," she said, her voice softening imperceptibly, acknowledging his courage. "Your cooperation will be noted. You are dismissed to internal affairs. They will be expecting you." Carter nodded, his jaw set, and walked out of the courtroom, his head held a little higher, a man stepping from the shadows into an uncertain, yet undeniably brighter future. His decision, while born of duress and profound moral conflict, was a pivotal moment, not just for him, but for the trajectory of justice in Crestwood. The news of Judge Reed's public humiliation and Officer Miller's immediate arrest exploded across Crestwood and beyond. Local news channels interrupted programming, running live reports from outside the courthouse. Social media platforms erupted, images of Judge Reed's shorn head circulating wildly, sparking outrage and solidarity. The story quickly went national, becoming a searing indictment of police brutality and racial prejudice within the justice system. The "Racist Cop Shaves Black Woman's Head" headline became a rallying cry, drawing unprecedented attention to the ongoing trial of Officer Thompson and the wider issues of police accountability. Back in her chambers, Evelyn Reed shed her robes. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, at the stark, uneven patches of scalp. A single tear, unbidden, traced a path down her cheek. The humiliation was still raw, the pain physical. But beneath it, a powerful, unshakable resolve simmered. This was no longer just about her. It was about every black person who had suffered silently at the hands of corrupt authority. She felt the weight of her judicial oath, but also the weight of her ancestral memory, of generations who had fought for dignity. Miller had sought to degrade her, but he had only ignited a fire. She picked up her phone, dialing a number she rarely used for personal calls. "Chief Evans," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I want Officer Miller investigated to the fullest extent of the law. I want every single one of his past cases reviewed, and I want Officer Thompson's trial postponed indefinitely. This court will not tolerate a miscarriage of justice fueled by corruption." She then contacted her trusted network of legal activists and civil rights leaders. "It's time," she told them, her voice imbued with a quiet power, "to ensure this never happens again. We will use this moment." The empire of Officer David Miller, built on fear and prejudice, didn't just crumble, it imploded, sending shockwaves through the entire Crestwood Police Department. The internal affairs investigation, fueled by Carter's detailed testimony and the undeniable public outcry, uncovered a vast network of corruption, planted evidence, false arrests, and systemic cover-ups. Miller was exposed as a serial abuser of power, a man who had terrorized a community for years with impunity. Dozens of his past convictions were immediately called into question, leading to a cascade of wrongful conviction appeals and releases. The district attorney's office, facing immense public pressure and the damning evidence, had no choice but to drop charges in many cases Miller had handled, and to initiate a full-scale review of all officers involved in his unit. The chief of police, facing a no-confidence vote and a city on the brink of revolt, was forced to resign. A new era, one demanding transparency and accountability, was painfully, slowly beginning to dawn in Crestwood. But the emotional and psychological toll on Evelyn was immense. The public nature of her assault, the constant media scrutiny, and the sheer maliciousness of Miller's act left deep scars that went beyond the physical. She was lauded as a hero, a symbol, but she also carried the heavy burden of that symbolism. She spent weeks undergoing therapy, dealing with the trauma, finding ways to heal not just the visible wounds, but the invisible ones. She also spent time reconnecting with her community, whose overwhelming support became a balm for her spirit. The strength she drew from them fortified her, transforming her pain into an even more potent resolve. She became a fierce advocate for judicial reform, for police accountability, for the rights of the marginalized, using her platform to speak out against injustice wherever she saw it. Her personal suffering had become a crucible, refining her commitment to justice into an unyielding, unbreakable force. The quiet, disciplined judge had transformed into a powerful public champion for change, her shorn head a defiant symbol of resilience against the very system she now sought to transform from within. The aftermath of Judge Reed's courtroom pronouncement sent shockwaves far beyond the granite walls of the Crestwood Municipal Courthouse. Officer David Miller's unceremonious removal and the visible evidence of his brutality, etched onto the presiding judge's scalp, sparked a public outcry that neither the Crestwood Police Department nor the District Attorney's Office could ignore. This wasn't just another accusation from a marginalized citizen. This was an assault on the very symbol of justice, witnessed by a courtroom full of media and legal professionals. The carefully maintained facade of routine misconduct within the department began to crack under the intense scrutiny. Immediately following his removal, Miller was taken to a holding cell in the courthouse basement. His rage, initially boiling, slowly began to morph into a chilling, calculated fear as the reality of his situation set in. He was no longer the untouchable enforcer of his own twisted justice. He was a suspect, trapped in the very system he had so confidently manipulated. He demanded a lawyer, a good one, someone who could make this all disappear. But the usual favors and back channels that had protected him for years seemed to have evaporated overnight. Captain Davies, the head of Internal Affairs, a no-nonsense officer known for his integrity, and no relation to Ben Carter, personally oversaw Miller's processing. Miller's badge and service weapon were confiscated, his locker sealed, and a full forensic audit of his department-issued phone and computer was immediately ordered. His reign of terror, built on a foundation of unexamined power, was definitively over. Meanwhile, Officer Ben Carter's testimony to Internal Affairs became the pivotal turning point. Shaken but resolute, he laid bare the full extent of Miller's corruption. For hours, he recounted every instance of planted evidence, every fabricated arrest, every subtle act of intimidation he had witnessed or been complicit in. He described the pressure Miller exerted to meet quotas, the casual racial slurs, the deliberate targeting of vulnerable individuals in Blackwood, and the chilling satisfaction Miller took in humiliating those he deemed beneath him. Carter provided dates, locations, names of victims, and corroborated his statements with fragmented notes he had secretly kept, detailing Miller's patterns of behavior. He confessed his own complicity, his fear, and his eventual decision to speak out, his voice often breaking with shame, but gaining strength with each truth he revealed. Captain Davies listened, his face grim. He knew whispers about Miller had circulated for years, but no solid evidence had ever materialized. Carter's testimony, coupled with the undeniable public humiliation of Judge Reed, provided the damning proof needed to dismantle Miller's operation. Captain Davies immediately expanded the investigation, pulling in other officers suspected of turning a blind eye or being involved in Miller's schemes. The unit that Miller had so proudly commanded began to unravel, exposing a pervasive culture of corruption that had festered within the Crestwood Police Department for years. The District Attorney's Office, caught completely off guard by the swiftness and severity of the scandal, was forced to act decisively. Facing immense public pressure and the undeniable evidence brought forth by the Internal Affairs investigation, they announced a comprehensive review of all cases handled by Officer David Miller. Dozens of wrongful convictions were immediately identified, leading to a cascade of appeals, and, in many cases, the release of individuals who had been unjustly imprisoned on fabricated charges. The city's public defender's office, emboldened by the revelations, launched a class-action lawsuit against the Crestwood Police Department, alleging systemic racial profiling and misconduct. The chief of police, a longtime associate of Miller's political patrons, publicly denied knowledge of the widespread corruption, but the mounting evidence and the intense public backlash ultimately forced his swift resignation. A temporary interim chief, known for his reformist leanings, was appointed, signaling a painful but necessary shift in leadership. For Judge Evelyn Reed, the days following the courtroom drama were a maelstrom of media requests, security concerns, and overwhelming public support. Her shorn head, initially a symbol of her violation, quickly became a powerful emblem of defiance and resilience across the nation. Images of her, stoic and unyielding on the bench, circulated widely, making her a national figure overnight. Civil rights organizations lauded her courage, while legal scholars dissected the extraordinary circumstances of Miller's unmasking. Despite the accolades, Evelyn sought solitude. She needed to process the profound violation she had endured, the deeply personal attack on her identity. She met privately with a trauma therapist, discussing not only the physical assault, but the deeper implications of living under constant public scrutiny as a symbol. The therapist helped her navigate the complex emotions, the initial shock and humiliation, the burning rage, and the profound sense of betrayal. Evelyn also drew immense strength from her family and her community in Crestwood. Her neighborhood, once fearful of the police, now rallied around her, their support a comforting balm for her wounded spirit. They brought her food, offered comforting words, and organized vigils in her honor, reminding her that her fight was their fight. One evening, a week after the trial, Evelyn received an unexpected visitor at her home, Officer Ben Carter. He stood on her porch, looking utterly defeated, his uniform rumpled, his eyes haunted. "Judge Reed," he began, his voice barely a whisper. I needed to apologize. Personally. For what happened. For not stopping him. I should have done something sooner." Evelyn looked at him, her gaze piercing but not condemning. She saw the genuine remorse, the profound guilt in his eyes. "Officer Carter," she said, her voice softer than it had been in court, "your testimony today, your willingness to speak truth to power, is a significant step. It took courage, a different kind of courage than what is usually celebrated on the force." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "What will you do now?" Carter swallowed hard. "I'm not sure, Your Honor. They're going to put me on administrative leave, likely a desk job. Miller's friends on the force, they're not going to forget this. But I can't go back to being that officer, the one who just watched. I want to be a cop who actually helps, who actually protects. I just don't know if there's a place for me in this department, or any department anymore." Evelyn considered him carefully. She saw not just a frightened junior officer, but a man wrestling with his conscience, genuinely seeking redemption. She knew the system needed people like him, people willing to challenge the status quo from within. "Officer Carter," she said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. "There is always a place for those who seek justice. And sometimes the most important work is done not from the top, but from the ground up, by rebuilding trust, one brick at a time." She paused, then added, "If you are truly committed to reform, to ethical policing, I believe there are avenues for you, both within the department, if it chooses to genuinely reform, and certainly within the community. There's a lot of work to be done, Officer Carter, a lot of healing that needs to happen." This was the call to action that Ben Carter desperately needed. It was not a forgiveness of his past complicity, but an invitation to redemption, a challenge to embody the very principles he had neglected. Evelyn saw in him the potential for a new kind of police officer, one who could genuinely bridge the divide between law enforcement and the communities they served. His decision to testify, while painful, was the first step on a long and arduous path towards rebuilding not just his own reputation, but perhaps a small part of the broken trust in Crestwood. His journey from complicit bystander to potential agent of reform had truly begun. The media continued its relentless coverage. The initial outrage over Judge Reed's shorn head evolved into a broader national conversation about police brutality, racial injustice, and accountability. Legal experts appeared on news channels, dissecting the systemic failures that allowed officers like Miller to thrive. Civil rights leaders organized protests and rallies in Crestwood, demanding sweeping reforms and justice for all of Miller's victims. The raw, visible scar on Judge Reed's scalp served as a constant, undeniable reminder, a silent, powerful demand for change that resonated far beyond the courtroom. It became a powerful catalyst, igniting a movement that Crestwood, and indeed the nation, could no longer ignore. The empire had crumbled, and in its ruins, the seeds of a new, more just system were beginning to be sown, slowly and painfully, but with an unyielding determination. The fallout from Judge Evelyn Reed's courtroom revelation was swift and cataclysmic, tearing through the Crestwood Police Department like a wildfire. Officer David Miller, the architect of his own downfall, found himself in a nightmare he couldn't manipulate. Stripped of his badge and weapon, he was now just another inmate in a sterile holding cell within the very courthouse he had once lorded over. His indignant roars of, "It's a setup," and "You'll regret this," faded into the background, replaced by the chilling click of the cell door locking behind him. The network of informal favors and silent complicity that had insulated him for years evaporated instantly, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. Captain Davies of Internal Affairs, a man whose reputation for unwavering integrity was a stark contrast to Miller's corruption, personally oversaw Miller's immediate processing, ensuring every procedural step was meticulously followed, leaving no room for escape. The ensuing internal affairs investigation, spearheaded by Captain Davies, was relentless and thorough. The public spectacle of Judge Reed's shorn head had provided the undeniable impetus, but it was Officer Ben Carter's testimony that truly broke the dam. For days, Carter sat with internal affairs, meticulously recounting years of Miller's abuses. He detailed the countless instances of planted evidence, the illicit drugs, the untraceable firearms, all designed to inflate arrest quotas and target specific communities. He spoke of the fabricated charges, the subtle intimidation tactics used to coerce confessions or silence witnesses, and the chilling pattern of racial profiling that had become Miller's signature. Carter didn't spare himself. He confessed his own agonizing complicity, his fear of Miller, and the profound moral conflict that had gnawed at his conscience. His voice, often raw with shame, gained an unwavering strength as he methodically laid bare the truth, providing names, dates, and locations that matched the scattered notes he had bravely kept. Captain Davies, his face grim with professional anger, found Carter's testimony devastatingly credible. He had long suspected systemic issues, but the depth of Miller's corruption and the number of officers who had either participated or turned a blind eye was shocking. The investigation quickly expanded beyond Miller, engulfing his entire unit and implicating several higher-ranking officers who had enabled his behavior through neglect or active complicity. The blue wall of silence that had protected Miller for so long shattered, as other officers, fearing the unfolding storm, cautiously began to come forward with their own stories of Miller's abuses, often corroborating Carter's statements. The district attorney's office, caught in the eye of this public and political hurricane, had no choice but to respond with unprecedented force. They announced a comprehensive, unprecedented review of every single case Miller had ever touched. The results were immediate and staggering. Dozens of wrongful convictions were identified, leading to a cascade of appeals and the release of numerous individuals who had spent years unjustly incarcerated on Miller's fabricated charges. The city's public defender's office, seizing the moment, filed a landmark class action lawsuit against the Crestwood Police Department, citing systemic patterns of racial profiling, false arrests, and widespread police misconduct. The chief of police, a figure long seen as untouchable due to his political connections, faced overwhelming calls for his resignation. With the city on the brink of widespread unrest and facing a vote of no confidence from the city council, he publicly denied any knowledge of the extent of Miller's corruption before resigning in disgrace. An interim chief, known for his progressive stance on police reform and community engagement, was swiftly appointed, signaling a critical, albeit painful shift in the department's direction. For Judge Evelyn Reed, the days following the courtroom drama were a blur of intense media attention, heightened security measures, and an outpouring of public support that was both overwhelming and deeply moving. Her shorn head, initially a symbol of her violation, quickly transformed into a powerful national emblem of defiance against injustice and the unyielding strength of resilience. Images of her, stoic and unwavering on the bench, circulated globally, elevating her from a respected judge to an iconic figure. Civil rights organizations lauded her courage, while legal scholars across the country dissected the extraordinary circumstances of Miller's public unmasking, analyzing the systemic failures that allowed such corruption to fester. Despite the accolades, Evelyn sought moments of quiet solitude to process the profound violation she had endured. The attack was not just physical, it was a deeply personal assault on her identity, her heritage, and her sense of safety. She engaged with a trauma therapist, grappling with the complex layers of emotion, the searing humiliation, the righteous rage, the lingering fear, and the profound sense of betrayal by those sworn to uphold the law. The therapist helped her navigate the difficult path of healing, focusing not just on the visible wounds, but on the invisible ones. Crucially, Evelyn drew immense strength from her family, and, perhaps most profoundly, from her community in Crestwood. Her neighborhood, once paralyzed by fear of the police, now rallied around her with an outpouring of love and solidarity. They brought her meals, offered comforting words, and organized vigils in her honor, reminding her that her personal struggle was intrinsically linked to their collective fight for dignity and justice. One evening, A week after Miller's dramatic arrest, Evelyn received an unexpected, cautious visitor at her home, Officer Ben Carter. He stood on her porch, looking utterly defeated, his uniform noticeably rumpled, his eyes haunted by sleepless nights and the weight of his conscience. "Judge Reed," he began, his voice barely a whisper, thick with remorse. I needed to apologize, personally, for what happened that morning, for not stopping him, for just standing there. I should have done something sooner. I should have been brave." Evelyn looked at him, her gaze piercing but devoid of judgment. She saw not just the police uniform, but the genuine remorse, the profound guilt etched on his young face. "Officer Carter," she said, her voice softer than it had been in court, yet still imbued with an undeniable gravitas. "Your testimony today, your willingness to speak truth to power, is a significant step. It took courage, a different kind of courage than what is usually celebrated on the force. It took moral courage." She paused, her eyes meeting his directly, unwavering. "What will you do now, Officer Carter?" Carter swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I'm not sure, Your Honor. They've put me on administrative leave, and I expect to be reassigned to a desk job, maybe even pushed out. Miller's friends on the force, the ones he protected, they're not going to forget this, but I can't go back to being that officer, the one who just watched, the one who was complicit. I want to be a cop who actually helps, who actually protects, who serves. I just don't know if there's a place for me in this department, or any department anymore after what I've done." His shoulders slumped, weighted by the uncertainty of his future. Evelyn considered him carefully. She saw in him not just a frightened junior officer wrestling with the consequences of his actions, but a glimmer of genuine potential, a man grappling with his conscience and seeking a path toward redemption. She knew that true reform within law enforcement wouldn't happen if all the good officers either left or stayed silent. The system desperately needed people like him, individuals willing to challenge the status quo and rebuild trust from within. "Officer Carter," she said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips, a spark of the warmth she typically reserved for her closest confidants. "There is always a place for those who truly seek justice, and sometimes the most important work is done not from the top down but from the ground up, by rebuilding trust, one brick at a time, one conversation at a time." She paused, then added, her voice imbued with a quiet challenge. "If you are truly committed to reform, to ethical policing, to rebuilding bridges with the community you once implicitly harmed, I believe there are avenues for you. Both within this department, if it chooses to genuinely reform, and certainly within the community itself. There's a lot of work to be done in Crestwood, Officer Carter. A lot of healing that needs to happen. And that work requires dedicated, ethical individuals like the one you are choosing to become." This was the call to action that Ben Carter desperately needed, a lifeline thrown to a man adrift in a sea of guilt and uncertainty. It wasn't a blanket forgiveness for his past complicity, but a powerful invitation to redemption, a profound challenge to embody the very principles he had neglected. Evelyn saw in him the potential for a new kind of police officer, one who could genuinely bridge the gaping divide between law enforcement and the communities they served. His agonizing decision to testify, while painful, was the critical first step on a long and arduous path toward rebuilding not just his own fractured reputation, but perhaps a small yet significant part of the broken trust in Crestwood. His journey from complicit bystander to a potential agent of reform had truly begun, charting a new course for his life and for the city. The media continued its relentless, widespread coverage, now focused on the systemic nature of the corruption Miller had represented. The initial outrage over Judge Reed's shorn head evolved into a broader national conversation about police brutality, racial injustice, and the urgent need for comprehensive accountability. Legal experts appeared on news channels, dissecting the pervasive systemic failures that allowed officers like Miller to thrive for so long with impunity. Civil rights leaders organized powerful protests and impassioned rallies throughout Crestwood, demanding sweeping police reforms, transparent oversight, and immediate justice for all of Miller's victims. The raw, visible scar on Judge Reed's scalp served as a constant, undeniable reminder, a silent, powerful demand for systemic change that resonated far beyond the courtroom, touching the conscience of a nation. It became a profound catalyst, igniting a powerful movement that Crestwood, and indeed the nation, could no longer ignore or dismiss. The empire of corruption, built on fear and prejudice, didn't just crumble, it imploded, sending shockwaves through every echelon of power. And in its ruins, the fragile but determined seeds of a new, more just system were beginning to be sown, slowly and painfully, but with an unyielding determination that promised a genuine transformation. 3 years later, Crestwood was still a city of two faces, but the shadows on one side were slowly, painstakingly, beginning to recede. The wounds of the past were far from healed, but a profound transformation was underway, fueled by the seismic shifts ignited by Judge Evelyn Reed's courage and Officer Ben Carter's profound act of conscience. The systemic corruption that had festered within the Crestwood Police Department for decades had been brutally exposed, leading to widespread reforms that, while imperfect, promised a future rooted in accountability rather than impunity. Judge Evelyn Reed continued to preside over her courtroom, her presence a living testament to resilience and unwavering integrity. The physical scars on her scalp had long healed, replaced by a closely cropped hairstyle that she now wore with defiant pride, a quiet symbol of her battle and her victory. Her reputation, already formidable, had solidified into that of a national icon, a tireless advocate for justice reform and police accountability. She accepted invitations to speak at conferences, advising federal task forces on judicial ethics and community trust building. Her personal story, once a private agony, had become a powerful narrative of strength, inspiring countless individuals and legal professionals across the country. Despite her elevated public profile, Evelyn remained deeply rooted in Crestwood. Her dedication to her community, particularly to empowering young Black women, intensified. She launched a mentorship program, Gavel and Grace, that paired aspiring law students from underserved communities with experienced judges and attorneys, ensuring that the next generation of legal professionals was diverse, ethical, and committed to true justice. Her laughter, once a rare sound, was now more frequent, a genuine, unrestrained expression of the hard-won peace she had found. Her evenings were still spent in quiet reflection, but the weight of sorrow had lifted, replaced by a deep, abiding sense of purpose and quiet contentment. Officer Ben Carter's journey was far more arduous but equally transformative. After his pivotal testimony, he faced the predictable backlash from the old guard within the police department. He endured months on administrative leave, followed by a reassignment to a thankless desk job and records. Yet, fueled by Evelyn's call to action and his own burning desire for redemption, he persevered. He volunteered for every community outreach initiative, attended police reform workshops on his own time, and actively sought out opportunities to rebuild trust. His earnestness, his humility, and his genuine desire to serve slowly began to chip away at the skepticism within the community and, surprisingly, among a growing number of younger, ethically minded officers who saw him as a beacon of change. Under the new interim chief, who later secured the position permanently, Carter was given an unprecedented opportunity. Recognizing his courage and his unique position as an insider who had broken the code of silence, the chief appointed Carter to a newly formed community engagement unit within the Crestwood Police Department. His role was to act as a direct liaison between the police force and the city's marginalized communities, focusing on restorative justice practices, mediating disputes, and building genuine relationships based on trust and mutual respect. It was a role that demanded immense patience and resilience, but Carter embraced it with an unwavering commitment, slowly transforming from a complicit bystander into a genuine agent of systemic change. He had found his purpose, becoming the kind of police officer he had once only dreamed of being: a protector, a bridge builder, a true public servant. And at the very heart of this renewed spirit in Crestwood was Maria, Caleb's grandmother. After the trial, Maria, a matriarch of the Blackwood community, became an even more vocal and powerful advocate for justice. Emboldened by Evelyn's victory and Carter's honesty, she founded the Crestwood Citizens Oversight Committee, a grassroots organization dedicated to ensuring police accountability and advocating for community-led reforms. This committee worked tirelessly, monitoring police activity, documenting instances of misconduct, and organizing town hall meetings that fostered open dialogue between residents and the police department. Maria became a formidable, respected force in city council meetings, her quiet strength and unwavering resolve impossible to ignore. Her efforts, combined with Judge Reed's judicial influence and Carter's work within the department, slowly but surely began to dismantle the lingering vestiges of prejudice and corruption, paving the way for a more equitable future. The final image of Crestwood reflects this profound transformation. It's a warm Saturday afternoon, vibrant and alive. Judge Evelyn Reed, no longer cloaked in her judicial robes, but dressed in casual, brightly colored clothes, stands in the bustling Blackwood Community Center. Her short hair, a testament to her journey, gleams in the sunlight streaming through newly installed large windows. She is surrounded by a group of young women, their faces alight with hope and curiosity, as she leads a Know Your Rights workshop, her voice clear and strong, empowering them with knowledge. Outside, in the newly renovated community park adjacent to the center, Officer Ben Carter is engaged in a lively game of basketball with a group of teenagers. Laughter rings out, free and unburdened by fear. Carter, no longer stiff and uncomfortable, moves with ease, his uniform a symbol of presence and protection, not oppression. He high-fives one of the players, a young black boy who looks up at him with genuine respect. And sitting on a park bench, observing the scene with a proud, gentle smile, is Maria. She watches the children, the thriving community center, and the police officer playing with ease among the youth. The weight of generations of struggle has not been forgotten, but the promise of a new dawn is palpable in the air. The city, once sharply divided, is slowly finding its rhythm, a symphony of disparate lives moving not in parallel, but together, harmoniously, toward a brighter, more just future. The seeds of a new dawn, planted in the crucible of injustice, had finally bloomed. If Judge Evelyn Reed's story stirred your heart and reminded you that courage can alter destinies and that light always finds a path even in the deepest darkness, please leave a comment below. Share this narrative with those who need inspiration. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell to never miss upcoming stories that delve into the profound human spirit and the power of unseen heroes. Thank you for joining this journey.